Hiya, it's David Stone, Beyond Reason. Today I'm talking about terms of engagement and who my targets are, but the terms of engagement is around the language and the concepts and the approaches that I'm proposing to take. My targets are people like Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Claudia Owens, Tucker Carlson. These are like social media types, but they're represented in the hierarchies of power by Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and Steve Bannon, these types. They're my targets because they, I think, are the ways in which our politics today are now based on mythology and the supernatural rather than reason, argument, debate, objectivity, peer review, which is key going forward. But I'm conscious that I'm using language which might not be familiar to everybody, so I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain my terms, the terms I use. My target is mythology and superstition and supernatural because these are, I think, how the rise of the new macho, self-confident, independent guy, alpha male, the stuff that we thought we'd got away from over nearly 100 years of struggle, has come back into the frame and is appearing everywhere across the world. Andrew Tate is the kind of personification of this. And, his sayings with regard to the role of men, our place in, as a guy, our place in the hierarchy of meaning, in the hierarchy of value, is taken out of the 19th, 18th century manual of kind of white exceptionalist macho paternalism. Even though Andrew Tate himself is of mixed race, his patronizing, patriarchal kudo is straight out of that playbook. But to get into it, I think that I need to go into some historical elements, some philosophical elements, certainly some ideological ones. And I need to explain some of the language and terms I'll be using. And these draw very much on having spent quite a few years doing philosophy, not as an academic, but as someone who's curious, an observer. Someone said that philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. I go along with that point of view. But I think that philosophy, either directly or indirectly, influences much of our discourse. And I'll explain all of that. But in order to explain that, I've got to explain some terms. So for me, having looked at the primarily Western Anglo-Saxon and analytical tradition in philosophy, what the analytical approach does is focus on logic and reasonable inference from available evidence or propositions. It's obviously much, much deeper, more complicated than that, but basically the Western tradition has a direct kind of lineage to Aristotle and the categories of understanding. One of the most frequently used one is the syllogism, the if P then Q, P then Q kind of argument. So all men are mortal. I'm a man, therefore I'm mortal. 3 parts to it. A proposition, all men are mortal. Supposition, I'm a man, and a conclusion, therefore I'm mortal. But the Western tradition itself, even though it goes way back before Aristotle, hit for me a kind of like major road in the path when we got to the Enlightenment. So I'm not going to go into a long historical pre-Socratic, Socratic discussion, even though there will be elements of that come up in due course. My point is that Aristotle established Aristotle departed from Plato in I think one major regard, which was that Plato believed in abstract forms as being the real world. The horse is a horse by how far it reaches horseness. There is this abstract form, and the abstract form is actually another dimension of existence, which we can only know through careful attention and philosophical contemplation, which Plato could do, and Plato's forms are his account of the ultimate true reality. Aristotle, even though Aristotle was a pupil of Plato, he rejected this idea because he felt that even though the forms exist, they don't exist in abstract, they're real. And that difference between the abstract and the real is going to permeate everything we do, because if you take something like the debate about whether maths is real or out there in the world to be discovered, the account of that and the explanation for either side is contained in this duality between the kind of Platonic form, in the mind, abstract kind of approach, and the Aristotelian grounded in the earth, in reality kind of approach. And people tend to take sides around these things, is either consciously, self-consciously or not, but that's just my judgment. So I'm not going to be absolutely 100% on my chronology here, but the other components of the Western tradition, but it's, again, a lot more complicated, because the European tradition that emerged in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, no 1920s even, so it's just post-First World War and pre-Second World War. These traditions come out of a broader distinction between realism and empiricism. And then between the two, there's idealism. So what you'll find if you look at the whole literature of philosophy is what they would call a German idealism, but a West European realist approach and a British empiricist approach. What does it all mean? It's still, some of that is to do with how far we can understand the world just by thinking about it, and how much we have to rely on our grasp of, in scare quotes, reality to get a handle on it. But some of the terms I'll be using include things like deduction, induction, and abduction, and intuition. Deduction is reasoning from the general to the particular. You have a general, usually these are tautological. They're general statements that are true by default. And the syllogism I gave you is an example of that. If you say something like, all bachelors are unmarried men, you made a statement, you describe something which is true, but it's true by definition. And the all bit is important because you're describing a general proposition. And The counterpart to deduction is induction. It reasons the other way round, from the particular to the general. The classic one in the literature is that you used to believe that all swans were white until we discovered black swans in Australia. And the point being, and this is the David Hume, who is one of the kind of founders of British empiricism, which we'll talk a lot more about, posed this problem of induction. How many instances of a thing, and the thing can be a billiard ball hitting another billiard ball, or a fire melting a block of ice, or the sun rising, or as Bertrand Russell, another inheritor of the British empiricist tradition, was wont to describe, how many times can a chicken be let out by the farmer to eat his meal before the chicken realizes it's been fattened for lunch? In other words, how many instances of a thing can lead you to a definitive conclusion about the causal factors that lay behind the appearance of that thing? And Hume says you can't. There's no amount of a thing that can give you the confidence to be entitled to claim certainty about those inductive outcomes. Now, I think that the problem of induction was solved by Karl Popper, who is another philosopher that will come into our frame of reference as we go forward. And there is a problem. There is a problem, and there is a resolution to it. Deduction, induction, abduction. Now, most of you will know that abducting something means to steal it or to take it away. In philosophy, abduction just means reasoning from inference of the best possible evidence. It's a kind of midway between deduction and induction. And it just says that when you look at a particular problem, say the problem of, is there evidence for the birth of Jesus Christ through divine intervention? There's no deductive approach to that. There's an inductive one, there's an evidential one, there's a storytelling one, there's a biblical one. The whole of that approach, hermeneutics, the interpretation of things, hermeneutics is another word, derives from Hermes, god of the messenger god. It means interpretation of evidence. Is there any evidence to support the claim for a thing? And then abduction says, yeah, there might be this, there might be advocacy or a story told, there might be a scroll, there might be an account in this setting and that setting, and it asks us to infer from that amount of evidence the likelihood of the thing being true. For induction and abduction, there's a very useful statistical method, which is called Bayesian statistics, which works at both qualitative and quantitative accounts of the consequences of data. How much of the data, in quotes, proves a point, and if it doesn't prove it definitively, what needs to happen going forward that will corroborate or add to the weight of that data. And then it doesn't resolve the problem of induction, but it does add to the technique of abduction, because it adds further as things expand and develop and so forth. It adds further weight to the claims made on the abductive basis. But as I said from the get-go, I'm not overly impressed with or confident in the Western tradition, and I think its departure, its point of departure at the point of the Enlightenment was a necessary but had some poor consequences, which I'll come on to. But I've looked at the Western tradition, and I've also looked at philosophies and something very close to philosophy, cosmology, from other cultural traditions, in particular Pan-Africa. There's not one African philosophical tradition, but hundreds. The only major characteristic of the Pan-African philosophical tradition is that much of it is oral, and it all done through performative methods, through dance, through music. We'll come on to that later on. But I looked at Arabian philosophy, Middle Eastern philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, Hinduism, Upanishads, Vedic culture, Taoism, Confucianism, this kind of stuff. All of it comes into my mind, into some semblance of a kind of collection of similarity, comparative similarities through these next series of terms, which I apologize for this, but I do think I have to go into the weeds of how mythology and the supernatural can be so powerful. And this stems from, I think, our journey from, as it were, purely an animal species of Homo erectus, Neanderthal, Devonian, whatever, to become Homo sapiens sapien. And this is just my take on this, but I think that separation, which I would describe as the move from biological determination or cultural or environmental determination to more autonomy and leading to societal features and culture, marks us out as being fundamentally different from other species. I call this species being. I think the term species being comes from some other sources which I don't remember. It might be Marx, it might be Lukács, I can't remember. But I'm just using this as a way of marking out. I know I'll be accused of anthropomorphism. My rejoinder to that is that's fair enough, but that's how it is. As far as we know, we're the only species that can have these conversations about the nature of reality, our own internal reflective processes, our own deliberations about who we are, what we might become. I don't think any other species does that. Some of my interlocutors will say, what about ET or aliens, or maybe we should pay more attention to the perspective of dolphins or whales or primates. At the moment, I'm open to all of that, but I just don't think there's anything in it. We can't base our views of possibility on the unknown. We don't know if there's any other sentient beings in the universe that might have a higher intelligence than us. I suspect there might be. But as we speak today, 2026, we don't know. And I see no point in speculating that there might be other perspectives that are more kind of like aligned to truth than ours, or more valuable in terms of understanding of ours. The idea that there is a reality external to us, though, is critical. And I'll come on to that later. But the terms that I think either indirectly or directly cut across or emerge from every single philosophical tradition and cosmology. Bear with me on this because I'm kind of like making something go along. Metaphysics is the umbrella. So the discussion about the nature of reality and existence and meaning and purpose is all taking place under the umbrella of metaphysics. Even science, but let me come into that in a bit. Metaphysics has, people believe I think three components. One is itself. Right? So people don't usually regard metaphysics as being its own thing, but I do. And under it, in conventional terms, you have ontology, which is theories about the nature of reality, and epistemology, which is knowledge. And knowledge of, knowledge about. In order to understand ontology, you have to have knowledge of what it is you're talking about. So metaphysics. So historically speaking, what the Western traditional method did was to try and distance itself from metaphysics, kind of like put the physics first and the meta, which means next to physics, afterwards. Treat physics as being part of what they called back in the day natural science, and see that as a special arena of knowledge of epistemology. In other words, in order for us to get to epistemology, we had to divest ourselves of some of the discussion about ontology. And I think that was the mistake made at the point of the Enlightenment. And I'll come on to explain that too. So the terms that, again, cut across all different cultures and all different philosophies, as far as I want to judge, and I am probably wrong and will admit to being wrong if I can be persuaded, are things like solipsism. Solipsism just means that everybody thinks that the nature of reality is what's contained in their own heads. At its most extreme form, the solipsist doesn't know whether other people have thoughts in their heads. He or she can only decide that on the basis of their own understanding. Fundamentally, solipsism doesn't see there being an external world other than the one that they can perceive. Solipsism is very closely aligned to another one of the categories that I'll be talking about, which is subjectivism. Many of the other terms come out of this idea that all we can know is what we experience subjectively. I reject solipsism, I reject subjectivism, but I'll explain why going forward. Nihilism. Nihilism is this kind of credo belief or philosophical view that there's no purpose to existence. Once, as Nietzsche said, God is dead, there's nothing to replace God with. Therefore, life loses meaning and purposefulness, and that applies to us individually and to species. Albert Camus was famous for producing his work on what he called the absurd, given the death of God and the rise of atheism. There could be no meaning other than the meaning that we agree on. Yeah, he's been portrayed as a nihilist, but he's actually the opposite. We'll come on to all this as we go forward, but nihilism is another one. And associated, you'll see the threads of this, associated with this is skepticism. The skeptic tradition is that you can't know the truth because it's too complicated, it's too deep, it's too profound, there's too much going on. Our senses are subject to hallucination or misdirection. So we have to always adopt a skeptical view of reality and nature and our place within it. And skepticism was, it was around in the day, back in early philosophy, but it became like very, very kind of well developed as a consequence of British empiricism and the view that you can't really know things with certainty. Everything we know has to be contingent. But for the British empiricists, this in quotes truth is a major problem. For me, it's a fantastic insight and a powerful opportunity. So solipsism, nihilism, idealism, naive empiricism, skepticism, these are kind of like, if you like, many of the terms and concepts and categories that will emerge in our conversations. Just to be clear, my response to a lot of this is, and I'm declaring my hand, I'm what you would call a direct realist. I'm not going to go into too much detail now, but it will come up. Basically, if I see a tree, or I'm sitting on my boat, which I am at the moment, what I'm seeing is real. Everything around me at the moment, my guitar, my computer, my microwave, my mug of tea, they're real. One of my go-to philosophers is Alex O'Connor, young Alex O'Connor, who does within Reason. Actually, so mine is like a counter to Alex O'Connor's. He declares himself to be a mereological nihilist. Okay, which I reject, but he does it with some force and some dignity and with some reason. Mereological nihilism basically says all we can know is that the world is made up of particles, and everything we see is just an assemblage of those particles, and we choose to call it a cup or microwave or a laptop. If you look at it in its real essences, it's just a collection of particles. That for me is a form of skepticism and a form of nihilism, which I don't find remotely tenable. The problem with it, and maybe Alex would like to come back on that, is that it is self-contradictory, because even if you describe the world as particles, you're making a statement about the nature of the world. You're giving it a name, and you get caught up, if you are a mereological nihilist, in this like loop of self-contradiction. Anyway, I'm a direct realist. I don't think there's anything that mediates my understanding of the tree. I said understanding, not perception. Because I don't think the perceptual road that we've been used to is justifiable. It's a big claim, this, I understand that. So my go-to person for direct realism is John Reed. He was around at the same time as David Hume, not as well known. And the people I've seen talk about him largely misunderstood him. It doesn't say that what we see is everything there is. You know, the tree is a thing. But what I think he's saying is that our understanding of it is not just based on perception. It's not part of the classical empiricist conundrum for me, which is that everything has to be based on experience. I don't believe that for a second. The tree exists, you see the tree, there's no mediation. We can talk about this, but the classical model is that all we see is the waves, the light waves, which give us the shape and the colour, texture, the distance, that kind of stuff. As if we were like sitting there as a passive receptor. There's an emitter of senses, and we're a receptor of those senses. And light waves bounce into the cones of our eye. They're transmitted down our optic nerve. They're upside down. Our brain inverts those images, and we start to grasp the concepts of what it is to be a tree. This is classical empiricism. We don't know the tree, we just know the concept of the tree. And that account explains why we see things that aren't there, mirages, or how we hallucinate, or how we can be wrong about our sense of the world. We don't see all there is the only concession I'll make to this idea. We don't see the roots of the tree. We don't see the mycelium, the fungus and the mushrooms, and we don't see the symbiotic relationships that exist in a way which is 10 times as complex and interrelated and symbiotic under the surface than we do on the surface. But we can know about them. So direct realism just does away with this perspectival approach completely, and that will come back as we go through. Alongside solipsism, nihilism, skepticism, empiricism, and idealism, I think is another term that we'll come across a lot, determinism. Basically, and very, very crudely, everything has a precondition or has a cause. the causes we don't control. The world since the Big Bang is just playing out kind of like predetermined course of development. And that goes into everything. It goes into atoms, molecules, it goes into genes, phenotypes, it goes into our biology, it goes into our psychology, it goes into our history, and it goes into our philosophy. Everything, as it were, has antecedent conditions which predetermine the outcome that we're seeing. I don't believe that's true for a second. The biggest counter argument to that, and I promise you I'll come back into this, but for me, the biggest argument to that is the second law of thermodynamics, which is the law of entropy, which is, I think, a complete and powerful refutation of determinism. Alongside this idea, though, is that because things are predetermined or largely determined, there's no such thing as free will, which I reject. And alongside that, and I think in the same kind of ballpark, is the idea that there's no such thing as objective morality. It's all made up. So another term, and I think this is going to be probably the last or second to last one, is nominalism. Nominalism just states, a bit like the solipsist or the mereological nihilist, is that there's no general propositions. There are only particular instances of a thing. The categories we give to put things into a set or into a group are just made up. There isn't a category, a general category of tree. There's just lots of individual trees. When we put them together and call it a wood, that's just language. That's just our description of a thing. Even to the extent that there's no such thing as a sea or a river or a sand dune as a collective reality. All those words are, for the nominalist, are expressions of our own, as it were, thoughts in how to create and articulate a sense of what they are through language. We're not actually describing anything of any real substance. So my targets are Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Claudia Owens, Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump, Steve Bannon. My guides, if you will, on this journey are people like Alex O'Connor, brilliant. But well before Alex O'Connor, back in the day, I'm looking at some Hegel, bits of Marx. Spinoza is a great go-to, especially in his form of theology, which wasn't really theology, but we'll go there. Locke, Berkeley, Hume. I go in there in a sense to form an opposition to them. I didn't go into it for that purpose, but that's what came out of the readings. Immanuel Kant is one of my go-to, even though he was a dyed-in-the-wool racist. Some of his ideas are compelling, especially about the importance of another term, the a priori. It's just knowledge that comes before experience, right? That's all it means. It's another complicated term that can be overused, but it just means there are categories of being, if you like, categories as part of our ontology of being that shape and inform our epistemology. The two most powerful ones for him were space and time, but another one, which is, I think, equally important, is causality itself. I don't think we learn causality. I think we come to know it, but it's already there. Anyway, but up to date, more modernly, we will go through people like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, just because they are counterbalances. We will touch on Avicenna from the Arab tradition, and we will get into a little bit of the Upanishads and African oral history. But the waters I've been swimming in for most of my life have been informed by the debate between the Western Anglo-Saxon analytical tradition and the European continental tradition. And in that regard, I will, on the one side, be drawing on two or three key figures from both, as it were, camps. Philippa Foot, Raymond Williams, and E.P. Thompson will come from the British tradition. And people like Foucault, Derrida, and Adorno will be coming from the European tradition. Why am I doing all this? It seems such a big task. I'm going to be going through each of these issues in much, much greater detail. But this is why. When I looked at the rise of National Socialism in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, and I'm going back 40 years when I did this, maybe even 50 years, I read Mein Kampf, and in it, Hitler sets out his thought in terms of the reclamation of German identity. And bear in mind that the German state had only been going for about 50 years at that time. But there was something stronger than that, and that was the Volk. Volktus means folk. It means folk people. For Hitler, the Volk was enshrined in a really weird Euro-Indian kind of concept of the Aryan, right? And Lebensraum, living space for the Aryan people, the credos or the creeds or the concepts that he brought into this conversation. That's what I mean by myth, because what Mein Kampf was based on and what the rationale for National Socialism was based on was bullshit. It was made up. But it harnessed something. It appealed to something. It went into some kind of rooted account of people who at that time felt dispossessed, disconnected, unlistened to, filled with resentment and grievance, and not knowing where to pitch that. So the first thing that the National Socialists did, and this was copied by Mussolini and has been copied ever since by the far right, was to construct a mythology of some earlier age, bygone day, when things were so much better than they are today, and explain the denial of that or the destruction of that by identifying another as the reason for it. And ironically, the other, we all know that the other for National Socialism was the Jew and Jewish culture, but it was also at that time the form of capitalism that was pervasive. And I want you to bear that in mind, because this is not a loose connection. The relationship between mythology, supernatural, and capitalism is absolutely essential in my kind of analysis of the underpinning reasons and conditions for the rise of the far right in 2026. I've not touched on all the people that I have depended on for my own journey in understanding. Philip Foot, Raymond Williams, E.P. Thompson, these are people who came into my awareness when I went to university in the 1980s, and they all were speaking after the Second World War, having witnessed the Holocaust and the genocide of millions of people. Important, right? Before we go down that road, before we allow those forces of divisiveness and destruction to continue to dominate our discourse, we've got to find a way of undermining it, reversing it, challenging it, and coming up with something better. One of the most powerful, proper, and credible developments of the Enlightenment, apart from the rejection of the supernatural, which I will come on to in more detail, was this idea that knowledge is actually a collective undertaking, the peer review. You don't know it, I don't know it, but between us, in our conversations, we can start to go through a process combining deduction, induction, abduction, and the final bit in my categorization of knowledge, intuition, sharing stories in today's jargon, lived experience, to try and do what I set out to do at the beginning. From a philosophical point of view, to have a strong interpretation, but from a political, social, and species being point of view, find a way of changing things.